Okay, well, we are going to get started, and as folks trickle in, those of you who are joining us, it would be excellent if you in the chat could write your name and then what organization that you're affiliated with. Welcome to the Silver Solutions webinar. Today we have Ted Grantham, who's going to be speaking about environmental flows. Just a little bit about this webinar. What our goal or what our hope was when we thought about doing this is really just to have an opportunity for those who are interested in water across the state. So whether or not you're a part of the water program team, anyone who's interested, just have an opportunity to talk to one another, to listen to the work that we're all doing, and potentially establish a foundation for collaboration. So that's why we're doing this. And yeah, it'd be great if you could chat in, whether if you feel shy, to tell us who you are and what brought you to listen. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Ted.
Great. So yeah, it looks like we just have a handful of people tuning in. So yeah, it would be great to hear from you now, if you don't mind.
So Michelle, Gabrielle, Shane, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, hi. I'm Gabi Meyer. I'm the beef cattle extension veterinarian. And well, water is an important topic, I think, for most people in California. And so I can't hurt to learn about it. So here I am.
Okay, looks like we do have a lot of people coming in. Maybe I would like to hear from everybody else, but I think maybe we should get started just for time. And then when we have questions, maybe we can do more introductions. Hello, everyone. My name is Ted Grantham. I'm a Cooperative Extension Specialist at UC Berkeley. I also currently hold a fellowship with the Public Policy Institute of California. I'm a Cal Trout Ecosystem Fellow, and much of my work focuses on freshwater ecosystem management in California. I study water and climate and water management, and much of my work emphasizes the sort of environmental consequences of the way in which we manage water in the state and throughout the world. Today, I'm going to give a pretty broad presentation and introduction to environmental flows and environmental flow science. Environmental flows just refers to efforts to secure water for environmental benefits, both for the conservation or protection of valued species, but also for the protection of valued ecosystem services that we as sort of humans as a society enjoy. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the policy context in California in which environmental flows are managed and the way that this has evolved over time. And hopefully I'll leave enough time for some questions from the audience. So just very briefly, the overview of the talk, I'm going to just define what environmental flows are and why they matter. I'm going to cover a little bit of the sort of technical approaches that are used to quantify environmental flow needs, and then give a bit of a perspective on kind of where things stand, particularly in California, with environmental flow protections and what we might see in the future. So you can see some chats here. I hope I'll keep an eye on the chat in case other questions come up or if there's any problems with sound quality. I'm currently calling in from the Bodega Bay Marine Lab, and I'm connected to their Wi-Fi network. So far, so good with the connection speed.
Hey,
so
Ted.
First, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We just told folks to chat in their name and their affiliation as they're coming in, so we know.
Okay.
That's all the chat's about right now.
Okay. Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
Thanks.
and if there is any question or something, yeah, we'll let you know. But
okay.
Otherwise, just yeah.
You'll mind the chat room. Okay. Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, kicking things off, what are environmental flows and why do they matter? I'd like to sort of start with a bit of perspective on the resources that we're referring to. So here's just a nice visual depiction of the Earth's water, and the largest sphere here represents all of the water on Earth, including in the oceans and streams and glaciers. That smaller sphere next to it represents all the fresh water on Earth, which includes water that both occurs underground and in glaciers. And that tiny dot that you see somewhere over Kentucky perhaps, represents the waters that we have, the surface waters, fresh waters that we have in our rivers and streams. So we're talking about a very small proportion of the land surface, maybe less than 1% of the land surface, and less than 0.1% of all global water is really the focus of this resource, right? Is what we're trying to manage and protect. And of course, this resource not only sustains organisms and rich biodiversity, but also people are highly dependent on these surface waters and rivers, streams, and lakes. And we put tremendous pressure on this resource to support our economies, our agricultural sectors, our cities, and to have fun, right? To fish and raft and recreate. One of the ways in which we put pressures on our freshwater resources is through the construction of dams. And this is a recent assessment of the global distribution of dams across the state. What we can see is an extremely high concentration of dams, particularly in places like the United States. And California is no exception, where we have about 1,500 dams that are considered large dams, and really tens of thousands of smaller dams. And collectively, these water projects have really transformed both the physical and biological characteristics of our rivers and streams. And we know that they not only create, say, barriers to fish movement, but they profoundly change the flow regimes, the timing and the volume of water that's passing through them. And as a consequence, they also change the ecosystem services and goods that are provided by healthy or intact river systems. One of the ways that we've studied how rivers have been altered in California is by looking at our stream gauge network. So we have gauges that are generally maintained by the U.S. Geological Survey that are distributed throughout the state. And we use modeling tools to predict what flows would be in the absence of dams and compare that to our observed conditions under our sort of current or prevailing management regime. And what we see is that nearly all of our gauge streams show evidence of flow alteration. And in particular, we see widespread depletion of high flows. So our higher flows are getting lower and our low flows tend to be getting higher. So we see this general what's been described as homogenization or stabilization of the flow regime in many of our rivers and streams. And this really reflects how we manage these systems to provide reliable water supplies. We capture as much water as we can in the winter months, and then often release those stored water in the summer months to provide water for downstream users. So one of the consequences of these changes in our river systems has been the widespread decline of our native freshwater species, and we see this across many different taxa, right? From fishes to freshwater dependent mammals to water birds. This was an assessment done a few years ago that showed that an extremely high percentage of our freshwater species in California, our native freshwater species, are now threatened. And certainly the changes in flow from dams and other human activities aren't the only cause, but they are a very important one. So the topic or the focus of environmental flows really addresses this fundamental question: how much water does a river need, and how can we manage our surface water systems, our rivers and streams and lakes, in ways that preserve the sort of the volume of water that's really needed to sustain healthy ecosystems while also meeting human demands. And this has been a question that has really, I think, sort of risen to the attention of the scientific community over the past about 20 or 30 years. I won't go through this graph in detail, but this paper, this figure from a paper depicts sort of the evolution of environmental flows and sort of the growing recognition of the importance of conserving or preserving water for the environment, as expressed through various policies and changes in scientific advances. And I just want to highlight two really key contributions. One is what we call the natural flow regime concept, and the second is the Brisbane Declaration. And just broadly speaking, what we've seen over the past 30 years is both sort of increasing awareness of the importance of securing water for environmental benefits, an increase in sort of the number of participants involved in engaged in this process, really moving from sort of dam operators to really organizations concerned with sustainable development, really at a global scale, and really moving to much more integrated ways of approaching water management that incorporate ecosystems in a more sort of effective way. So the natural flow regime was really a seminal paper when thinking about approaches to managing environmental flows. And this paper simply stated that the ecological integrity or the health of river ecosystems really depends on their natural dynamic character. In other words, rivers are inherently dynamic systems, and the only way we can preserve their health and the services they provide is by maintaining some degree of that dynamism. The second thing this paper did was focus really holistically on flow regimes, so not just on single aspects of flow in rivers, but really identified these different aspects of the flow regime described by the magnitude or volume of water, the frequency of particular flows, the timing, the rate of change of flows, and how they related to different aspects of the ecosystem that then supported ecological integrity. So, the timing and volume of flow controls water quality, the fluxes of energy, physical habitat, the movement of sediment, for example, as well as sends important signals to species, for example, for salmon to migrate. After this paper, it really got, I think, the scientific community a bit more engaged in this topic, and there was quite a bit of research exploring how different facets of the flow regime relate to different ecosystem attributes. And this paper came out that kind of lays out some of the principles that have been identified. Basically, the flow regime and this variation in flows from high flows to low flows all serve really important roles in supporting ecosystem health, from providing the as a disturbance agent that both creates and habitat and disturbs habitat to create opportunities for other species by triggering certain life history strategies like spawning and migration, and importantly also connecting habitats like our floodplains when we get high flows. So following from this sort of growing appreciation of the importance of natural flow variation and natural flow regimes for ecosystems, also came an increasing appreciation for the services and values that were provided to people and to society by healthy ecosystems. And this Brisbane Declaration came about, was released in 2007, which really represented the views of an international group of river scientists who took on the challenge of just defining environmental flows formally for use in various sort of policy contexts. And I just want to highlight a few key words here. First of all, under this sort of definition of environmental flows, it's not simply defined as water for the conservation of biodiversity. It's really focusing on the benefits that both that society, that people derive from healthy ecosystems. It also focuses on, you know, the need to really balance the needs of ecosystems with the needs of people in sustainable ways, and finally highlights the role of both and sort of the importance of participatory decision making in making decisions around environmental water, and the role of science. So I think this declaration really reflects sort of our current RSA, you know, sort of the scientific community's sort of current understanding of environmental flows, and what we should be sort of seeking to, how we should approach managing environmental flows in different contexts. So that's a quick but fairly broad background on environmental flows. Now, the next few minutes, I want to dig a little deeper into some of the technical approaches for how we actually quantify environmental flow needs at particular in particular rivers. And it's both a scientific and very much a social process, which is really important to acknowledge. And I really see it as kind of a two-step process. Well, first we have what's traditionally called environmental flow assessment, which is very much a technical or scientific process where we have particular environmental objectives we want to achieve. Maybe that's the restoration of a healthy salmon population, or the maintenance of certain water quality for drinking and swimming and fishing. Regardless of our environmental objectives, once those objectives are defined, it's really a scientific, sort of question or technical process to figure out what is the water needed to achieve those objectives. But then comes sort of the next step, which is the balancing, right? Which is how do we then incorporate these needs within our water management systems in relation to all the other demands that we place on in our ecosystem. And this is very much a process that occurs within the agencies. Like in California, for example, it's really the State Water Board that's responsible for achieving these balancing. But hopefully, if they do that process well, we'll end up with really recommendations for how to meet environmental water needs while minimizing impacts to other water users. So that first process is really a technical process, which involves primarily scientists and technical experts, and the second component is really more of a social and political process that is led by agencies and through kind of participatory decision making. So again, back kind of more on the technical side, I want to highlight three approaches that are commonly used for quantifying those ecological flow or environmental flow needs. And these can be loosely grouped into these three methods. One, hydraulic habitat; two, hydrologic methods; and three, statistical methods. And so the first class of methods really focuses on the hydraulics, or the hydraulic conditions of rivers and streams as a function of flow. And by hydraulics, I mean variation in depths and velocities that occur in stream channels at different flow rates. So it really recognizes this interaction of flow, which is a sort of a volume of water per unit time moving through the physical structure of a channel and creating variation in depths and velocities that different species are sort of adapted to take advantage of. And so here you see an example of a hydraulic model. This is a computer simulated representation of what depths and velocities would be at a particular flow rate for this stream in Sonoma County on which I've worked. Once we've done the work of actually sort of modeling the physical behavior of these rivers, in other words, once we sort of look and see how velocities and depths for these rivers change across a range of flows, we can incorporate information about habitat preferences for particular species that we may be managing for. And this is a very common approach for salmon and trout in particular, which have very specific preferences for ranges of depths and velocity that in which they tend to occur. And so what's done is some basically observational studies are done to figure out where particular species are within the river channel in terms of depths and velocities and substrate and so forth. And then it's linked to those modeling efforts, those modeling outputs that I showed, to generate these weighted usable area curves. So this graph on the right basically shows how the weighted usable area, or the total available area of habitat, increases or changes as a function of flow. And so you can see for example, the blue line represents how food production increases with flow until about 4 cubic meters per second, and then decreases. And you can see how the suitable habitat for these two other species, adult brown trout and common bully, have slightly different responses, where for the bully, it really kind of peaks at one cubic meter per second and then declines, whereas the adult brown trout peaks a little bit later. And so these types of curves can then be translated into flow recommendations, right? So if you were trying to manage the system as a trout fishery, for example, you might recommend a seasonal base flow of 1 cubic meter per second in this particular river or stream. Another class of approaches that are used can be kind of classified as hydrologic methods. And these really focus not so much on the ecology of the rivers, but actually the hydrologic characteristics of rivers. And this really focuses on characterizing different aspects of the flow regime. So here we see sort of a hypothetical hydrograph, which is just daily flow plotted over time, so discharges flow. And what we see here is that we can describe these sort of erratic patterns by a suite of characteristics, right? So we can look at the timing of when certain flows occur, the magnitude, how high they get, how quickly flows change, the number of times that certain maybe peak flows of certain magnitudes, and then the duration of particular flows, like base flows, for example. And these characteristics of flow regimes can be quantified by particular metrics, right? So we can look at the average flow in July, or the 1-day minimum flow. And so we can quantitatively describe these metrics, and we might look at, say, go to a gauge that has minimal human influence, quantify these reference conditions, right? We would quantify these various metrics and use that as sort of a reference for how we might set objectives for different types of rivers. A third class of approaches that are used to quantify environmental flow needs, I focus broadly on defining these ecological flow relationships, which often involve the use of statistical methods to relate some sort of flow characteristic or flow metric, like I mentioned before, to some ecological or biological response. And so here you see on the y-axis is a stream condition index, which is derived from biological monitoring data of stream macroinvertebrates. So basically insects that live in these streams are sampled at a site, and depending on the abundance and diversity of those samples, they're assigned a condition index, which represents sort of a gradation of poor to high quality. So we can plot those condition that condition index against some measure of alteration. And in this case, what we see is that when March stream flows are depleted, this is from a stream in the Sierra Nevada, is depleted. In other words, when our observed values are below expected, we see a decline in stream condition. And it's really this sort of range between sort of 20% change in flow that we maintain these higher condition factors or index values. So the next step in the process, so regardless of the method that's used, often we use multiple methods when trying to develop environmental flow recommendations. But you might use these different methods depending on data availability or the target objectives, and then ultimately translate those relationships into environmental flow recommendations. And in a this is just a sort of a schematic of what a sort of gross simplification of what a natural flow regime might look like in a California river, let's say a river of the California Central Valley, and the green represents what a typical altered flow regime would look like under a typical management regime in the Central Valley, where you can see that the difference between sort of the brown and the green shading indicates sort of depletion of winter flows and the loss of variability, particularly throughout the winter, and then potentially augmented flows in the summertime when we're releasing water for downstream urban and ag uses. So, based on the, sort of the background information I just provided, what scientists, I think, are, scientists challenged with making recommendations for how to restore a healthy ecosystem would be a hydrograph that might look like something like this, where you would be kind of bringing back patterns of natural variation in the system, not necessarily the full amount of water, but certainly bringing back certain patterns of variation in the system, and basically restoring variation. Of course, there are many challenges to actually implementing this type of approach. Like one, even if it is not restoring the full flow regime, it still takes a lot of would still take a lot of water. And two, from a practical perspective, it's just hard to sort of dynamically manage flows below reservoirs in this way. What do managers want? They really want a number, right? They want to know how much water is needed for the environment, and ideally one that doesn't change very much. And I think historically, certainly in California and elsewhere, this has often been sort of the de facto sort of approach for allocating environmental flows, where you would have a rule like this, like a minimum of 5 CF should be released below a dam for a particular period of time. And sort of what this translates to in terms of an environmental flow prescription is really like a flat line flow that may vary between winter and summer, but generally is quite stable, which we know from both sort of ecological theory as well as sort of empirical evidence that this is unlikely to produce ecological, or is likely to be insufficient for restoring healthy ecosystems in most cases. So, what we're seeing and sort of where we can kind of come to, kind of a common ground would be this type of approach, where you introduce the idea of having a more seasonally variable hydrograph that brings back some elements of variability, but is still kind of workable within the context of dam operations. And so what that might look like is something like this, where you would have still have some minimum flow that would be required, but then you start to introduce some variation at critical times of year that are relevant for both sort of supporting key physical processes like sediment mobilization, as well as ecological processes like migrations and spawning. And so this would be just sort of a hypothetical example of a sort of a more nuanced approach for managing environmental flows in California rivers. So, there are a few examples in California where this I would say sort of these more advanced approaches have been implemented, and one of my favorite examples is Putah Creek, just outside of Davis, California. Here we see On the right, this kind of schematic, Putah Creek flows out of Lake Berryessa behind Monticello Dam and flows into flows east into the Central Valley. Really an area dominated by agriculture, but you can see that little ribbon of river passing down towards Davis. This river has really been changed since in the past 100 years, but major changes really occurred in the 1950s when Lake Monticello Dam and what was built, coupled with the Solano irrigation project. So what you see is a major reservoir built in the headwaters in the Coast Range, and then about a couple miles downstream, a second diversion dam was constructed, which takes water from the river and sends it through this irrigation canal to farmers in the area. For about the last 20 or 30 years, there has been some monitoring of the fish community within Putah Creek. So this is following well after the construction of these dams, and what you see is a pretty interesting pattern of fish species. So immediately below the dam, where flows are actually maintained at a pretty high rate, pretty much year round, you actually see a really healthy trout fishery, because trout tend to like cold water and relatively stable flows. And so you actually see a sort of a fish assemblage or fish species that are dominated by natives. As you move downstream to the lower Putah Creek, below this diversion dam, you see a very different suite of species, also primarily historically dominated by native species, but more characteristic of kind of the warmer Central Valley waters. And these are fish like the pike minnow or the Sacramento sucker, hitch, and California roach. And as you move down even lower into the system, as you start getting close to the Yolo bypass and where the Putah eventually flows into the Sacramento River, we tend to see more non-native species, and this is because the habitats within this reach have been highly altered and just are no longer suitable for native species. So what happened with Putah Creek is that there was basically a drought, and in I believe it was the 80s that led to even further restrictions, or basically higher diversions and even less water being sent down to lower Putah Creek, which led to creek drying and a lot of fish die-offs. And there was sort of concern that the native ecosystem of Putah Creek was on the verge of collapse. And so UC Davis and some environmental organizations basically went to court with the irrigation district, and which led to several years of sort of debate within the court, but what ultimately led to an agreement which is known now as the Putah Accord. And within this accord, what they basically did was recommend that the total amount of water allocated to the environment be increased on the order overall by about 20%. So we're not talking about sort of a substantial change in the total amount of water allocated. It still represents less than 10, I think less than 10% of the total annual volume of the river itself. But most importantly, they recommended that these environmental flows be allocated at times of year that are most beneficial for native species. And in this case, this is really targeting the spring period, when many of these native fish species are evolved to, it's when they breed. And they're adapted to take advantage of the natural high spring flows that would have occurred in an unregulated or undammed river system. And so there were also some recommendations to increase winter base flows and to send flows to encourage, protect salmon migration. So one of the reasons I like this story is it's one of the few examples where we actually see a clear, documented response to this change in the management regime. And let me just take a minute to sort of unpack this figure. What you see here in this sort of series of graphs are the changes in native fish abundance, so the proportion of native species as you move from the top of the river at near Monticello Dam down towards its confluence with the Sacramento River. So kilometer 0 is basically at the dam, kilometer 6 is at the diversion dam, and then as you're moving downstream to 16 to 21, that's kind of getting closer to Davis, and then kilometer 25 and 30 is even further downstream. The gray bars shown on each of these panels show you the proportion of native species that were observed in the river prior to the Putah Creek Accord, and the white next to the right are the post-Putah Accord years, so after this new environmental flow regime was implemented. What you see is that in the upper watershed, so right below the dam, you actually already had primarily native species occurring in this area. This is that trout fishery that I mentioned, and so you already had an area dominated by natives, and as you implemented these regulations, you saw basically almost exclusively natives after introducing these changes. Moving down to the sort of the middle reaches between kilometer 6 and kilometer 21, that's where you saw a really big effect of these changes in the timing and volume of flows, transitioning these flows to particularly focusing on these spring flow conditions. What you see is this major uptick in the proportion of fish species that are native and a reduction in non-natives. And as you move downstream to these lower reaches, you don't really see any effect. And that really speaks to the importance of habitat, right? Where these systems are in these lower reaches are so degraded that even though we provided these additional flows that were targeted at native species, the habitat simply wasn't there to sort of take advantage of that additional water, and that other factors were limiting the recovery of native species. So here we see sort of a clear example that sort of changing the timing and the volume of water to meet the needs of these native species can really have a positive effect. The other reason I like this story is that after this this new sort of management regime was implemented in the 90s, there's just been a tremendous amount of community interest and support in the health of this creek. So as native fish have recovered, we've also seen the recovery of riparian vegetation. We've seen the recovery of native birds, and the river itself has really become a focal point. I think sort of really one of the great aspects of living in this area is this resource, and the irrigation district, I should say, where once they were, I would say, probably quite against releasing water for the environment, they've actually become an incredible steward of this resource and are very invested in maintaining the health of this system. So this is what Peter Moyle would often refers to as a reconciled ecosystem, where we start with a sort of maybe a period of conflict between sort of competing human needs over water and environmental and human needs over water, but then we've reached a solution here that actually works for both people and the environment, and works quite well. So one example that I always enjoy highlighting in the context of environmental water, which can often be a source of great conflict, and what many see as sort of a zero sum game. I just don't think that's the case. So that brings us to today. I mean, and kind of where we are in California. And so in the last maybe 5 or 10 minutes here, I just want to give you my sort of perspective on current status of environmental flows and kind of the outlook for how this issue is evolving in California in particular. And one thing to note here is this map here, these two maps side by side. So the map on the left shows basically California's stream network. This shows all the rivers and streams in the state, and the different colors just represent streams that have slightly different characters in terms of their flow regimes. And the graph on the right, or the map on the right, really shows those rivers for which environmental flows are sort of codified in law. Environmental flows are sort of formally recognized in some sort of legal legal way, and this is often through biological opinions, through in Endangered Species Act regulations. They may also be associated with water quality or regulations under FERC, which are the regulations that manage hydropower dams. But the point of showing this map is just to say that really, even though many of our large rivers like the Sacramento and San Joaquin do have environmental flow protections to some degree, most of our rivers and streams do not. And this is a problem, or sort of a concern when we look to the future, particularly for our species like salmon, that are really going to depend on reliable sources of cold water into the future. So there was a recent assessment done a couple of years ago that basically said if present trends or kind of present management regimes continue as they are, we can expect to lose about half of our salmon and trout in the state. And so what this says to me is that again, while water is not the only issue that needs to be addressed in sort of restoring our habitats or restoring these fish populations, protecting these fish populations, water is certainly a key component. So to really take on this challenge, I want to highlight a recent effort which I'm a part, as well as Sam Sandoval and other collaborators at UC Davis. And this effort, which we broadly refer to as the California Environmental Flows Framework, is a broad effort to improve both the scientific sort of rigor of the way environmental flows are sort of quantified and implemented, as well as simply increase the sort of the pace and effectiveness of environmental flow management throughout the state. One of the sort of key aspects of this effort has been a working group that's involved very close engagement with a lot of the management agencies that have a nexus here with environmental water, like Department of Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Board, among others. And this environmental work group has really been a forum for talking about sort of the challenges and technical approaches for managing environmental flows in the state. And the specific mission of this work group is to really advance both the science of environmental flows, but also advance its application for supporting management decisions, and particularly in addressing decisions that are attempting to manage natural resource needs with consumptive water users. So this group it's a public group that's been meeting for a few years now, and are really trying to tackle this issue and issues around environmental flow management. This group is sort of overseeing the development of both technical and implementation projects, and so the work that I'm involved with, as well as others on our technical team, like Sam and others, have really focused on the technical product development. So thinking about sort of what are the scientific analyses and tools that are needed to really inform decision making and the implementation of environmental flows, as well as the development of what we're calling implementation projects, which are really sort of guidance documents and thinking about engaging sort of broader groups in this effort. In terms of the framework itself, the framework is this environmental flows framework is it's a sort of a broad approach that provides guidance for defining environmental water needs or environmental flows at any river and stream in the state, and it has what we call a two-tiered approach, where the first tier provides a approach for setting flow targets statewide at any river and stream. And we say it's a reference base because it uses information on sort of the natural reference hydrology. So what hydrology would be in the absence of human activities to set those targets. That's not relevant for many of our managed systems. And so in tier 2, we really provide sort of guidance for how to sort of refine those recommendations to address sort of the unique management context or unique management objectives that may exist in different parts of the state. And sort of overlaying all of this is sort of some I think sort of key principles around sort of open data and information dissemination to the public. So this can be a very sort of transparent process. Underlying this framework is sort of conceptually is what we call a functional flows approach. And this, I think, brings in some of the elements that I've already discussed here. And the basic idea behind what we mean by functional flows is basically recognizes that there are particular aspects of the flow regime that are disproportionately important in supporting both physical and ecological functions in rivers and streams. So there are like winter peak flows, for example, do a lot of sort of physical work and also can be, provide triggers for migration. The spring snowmelt recession is another example. So there's been a lot of research sort of underlying this this conceptual approach of functional flows that has helped us to identify these what we're calling functional flow components. So these are, again, aspects of the flow regime that are disproportionately important for managing the health of freshwater ecosystems. And so these include are the fall pulse flow. So this is generally your first storm of the winter season that kind of remobilizes organic material, can also serve as a signal for a lot of species. Peak magnitude flows I already mentioned. Wet season base flows can be really important for maintaining connectivity within river networks to allow for things like fish migration or spawning. The spring recession flow, this can be very pronounced in snowmelt systems, but also occur in rainfall systems. And then the dry season low flow period, of course, is really important in many systems for maintaining a living stream and perennial systems. So we've identified these flow components, and these have been identified through really, drawing upon, sort of years of study of rivers in California to really hone in on the most important aspects of river flows. And what we do as part of this process is take these components, and we can then actually quantify those components by different metrics, right? So we can look at the fall pulse, and we can describe the characteristics of that flow pulse in terms of its magnitude and timing. We can look at the wet season base flow and characterize that in terms of its magnitude, timing, and duration. So each of these sort of X's represents a different way in which we can define these different components. And the idea here is that we can then take those sort of quantified metrics, do subsequent analysis to inform kind of their ecological significance, or just use information on those sort of natural ranges of these various metrics to set environmental flow recommendations. And so the idea here behind a functional flows approach for setting environmental flows would be something like this, where we would have, again, not be restoring the full natural flow regime, but would be really honing in on particular functional flow components like the fall pulse flow, the wet season flow, the spring snowmelt recession, to make sure that those key functions of rivers, both ecological and physical, are preserved. And we think this approach offers sort of promising in a California context because it certainly uses less water than attempts to sort of preserve the full natural range of variation. It's supported by our science, which says that these certain components of the flow regime we know are really important ecologically, and it uses, it just uses less, potentially can use less water. And so, the last comment I want to make about the functional flows approach is that in order for this to work, we also have to sort of couple the way in which we manage environmental flows with structural habitat improvements, and in particular in places like the Central Valley. We're only going to sort of realize the benefits of these functional flows if, particularly the high flows, if they're able to sort of access the landscape and to sort of recover the processes that make these flows so important. In the winter, for example, when we tend to see, historically would have seen, vast areas of the Central Valley flooded, in association with those high flows, those were often really important times both for fish, fish migrating, fish breeding, and for fish growth. And so this is just to say that flows in many ways are a necessary but insufficient condition for restoring the health of ecosystems, and that we also need to couple those flows with habitat improvements. So this is, very much a work in process, this approach that I laid out. But we do have a website here that I encourage you to explore if this is a topic that interests you. This will be sort of updated as we continue to sort of build sort of documentation around this approach. And there's also some links to some great other tools that our team has developed. So encourage you to check that out. And yeah, just in conclusion, I hope this has been sort of an informative presentation for you. I hope I've sort of convinced you why environmental flows are important for both native species recovery and for people and the preservation of ecosystem services. There really has been an evolution of environmental flow approaches, and I think we're really sort of at a transition point now where we're moving away from minimum flow protections to an approach that's sort of a bit more nuanced, and recognizing that we have to restore some dynamism in these systems to achieve our objectives. I've highlighted that very few rivers actually do have formal environmental flow protections in the state, and those that do often focus on single species or even single life histories of species. And I think we can do better, and some of the tools that we're developing and approaches that we're developing through this environmental flows framework, I think should help to really increase both the scale and effectiveness of environmental flows in California. That is all I have today. It looks like we have about 10 more minutes. I'd love to, take a few questions, or if you have to head off, or if you're tuning in on YouTube at some future date, you can email me with questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Ted. Does anyone have any questions? I have some, but I want to open it up. Somebody is.
I have a question. So with this all sounds, very nice. Are you still getting any pushback from groups about this approach?
Well, I think it's probably, we're kind of at a stage where we're fairly early in the process, and I think there's still not all of particularly the water user groups, I don't think have been fully, sort of informed of this approach yet, and we're still in the process of sort of, vetting it in many ways. So I think I expect there will be some pushback, but I also think that it's better than a lot of the alternatives, in that it provides, I think, some both sort of flexibility in the way that water is managed, and also, you know, potentially can provide increased certainty, you know, to the water user community, which is often, you know, sort of as important as, you know, sort of the volume of water that's allocated in any given year.
Okay, so my question is whether there have been attempts or there's any attempts underway to kind of pair these ideas with water quality issues like nitrate or salinity, whether there are attempts to kind of incorporate that into the framework, and whether that, or whether quality has just gotten in your way or gotten in the way of implementing.
Oh no, it's a great point, and I think that's definitely on people's minds. So we're right now, you know, kind of where we are with this sort of kind of rollout or development of this framework. We have sort of the conceptual framework developed. We have this this sort of statewide approach developed that really, I think, provides kind of a first cut. But in many places that I think have issues, particularly related to water quality, are going to require. It's inevitable that additional analyses are going to be required. You're not just going to be able to use sort of reference hydrology to set those rules. There are some examples in Southern California where we're doing some case study analysis in which water quality is really the primary concern. And I think the you know, this framework is not sort of prescriptive in the sort of the methods that are being used. It's intended to sort of provide sort of an overarching structure, and allowing sort of methods that are sort of tailored to specific problems be sort of integrated in the approach. There's a big emphasis on things like setting management objectives, right? Which just seems so you know, maybe a bit mundane, but is also so critical to sort of the path that's taken in terms of you know, both the methods that are used, but also how these recommendations end up being implemented. So I would say water quality is definitely on people's minds. There's a lot of interest in how sort of the tools and these approaches can help inform management of systems where water quality really is the issue, both in the Central Valley with respect to Sigma implementation, I would say, as well as in Southern California, where there's issues around wastewater discharges. And I think probably issues with temperature in places like the Sacramento River, and maybe even some of our coastal systems. But I would say that there's still you know, certain technical work that remains to be done, but that's certainly I think the intent is to address, you know, issues other than, you know, water quantity specifically under this framework.
And Ted, just to add also to Gabby question. So when Gabby was asking about if there is any pushback, I think one of the good things is that this at the beginning tries to set the field, level the field for everyone. So everyone is departing from the same analysis with some suggested recommendations. But those are basically for the ecosystems. Then it will come the second step, the social part that you mentioned in your presentation, which is now let's involve the stakeholders and let's come up with the balance. And that I can see that it might be difficult, but that is not on the scientific part. So I think we're laying out that one. And then in the other one that Malika was mentioning in terms of water quality, I mean, it is in the framework, it can be considered. We are providing some guidance for it. That is a little bit more mix and match. So if you enter in a basin and you find that that's what you are impaired, or one of the layers, so you can put that layer of water quality on top of the water quantity and so on. Yep, sorry. Any other question? I think we're right on time.
We respect your time, so we're going to close it. But just a reminder, Safik is on right now, and the next month's webinar is going to be featuring Safik con talking about watershed management. So join us again.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm going to be a little wild. We might. It is 4 o'clock here. We might have a beer or something. I don't know. Just saying.
Yeah. Hey, and one other thing, I think it's at some point we have up to 12 people, and I'm not sure how many people will be joining there. On my side, it was quite a nice luxury to hear Ted doing this big
awesome.
road. I really enjoyed it. Anyway, so
Thanks, Sam.
tune in next month.
Next month, Safik will be talking, and thank you so much, Ted, and everyone. Have a fabulous Tuesday.
All right. Thank you too for coordinating this. Okay.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye bye. Do you want
To stop the clock. Yes.
All right. Thanks so